Straight from the streets of New York City, Porkins Policy Radio. Here's Pierce Redmond.
Oh, and I think now I'm here. I think I had muted my microphone. So hello, everyone. Welcome to Porkins Policy Radio. I am your host, Pierce Redmond. You can find this show here at Ocelli.com every Tuesday from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Of course, you can also find the website. You can find the show on my website, which is PorkinsPolicyReview.com. If you are new to the show, there are lots of ways to listen. You can find me on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, Podbean, Player FM. I'm also, of course, on YouTube, so subscribe there if that's your preferred medium to listen to podcasts. If you want to support my work, you can always go to patreon.com/Pierce Redmond, and you can sign up to be a subscriber to me for as little as $1 a month. And that single solitary dollar, of course, gives you access to the bonus podcast. And very quickly, I just wanted to thank George for recently signing up to Patreon, especially at the $5 level. So thank you so much, George. That means a lot, and that helps out tremendously. Well, as my door creaks in the background, today we are joined, welcoming back a friend of the show, Kevin Gosztola of Shadowproof.com. I don't think Kevin needs much of an introduction. He's been on the show many times before, but Kevin is an excellent journalist. He covers a variety of topics at Shadowproof.com, including what we're going to be talking about today, which is Julian Assange and press freedom and the sort of national security state and much more. But Kevin Gosztola, how are you?
Doing well. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, Kevin, why don't we just kind of jump right in? I've talked about Assange a little bit on previous episodes, and last week we did a call-in show, and I touched on this a bit. But why don't we just sort of give us an idea? I mean, what is happening right now? The situation is still fluid. It's unfolding as we speak. What's the latest in terms of what's going on, maybe legally speaking, with Assange? He's still in prison in the UK. Is there anything new that we should know about?
As far as it stands right now, we have Julian, who is in a UK prison, and there's a hearing that I understand will take place on May 2nd. And that pertains to, some of these issues that relate to the bail conditions that he's accused of violating when he sought asylum from Ecuador long ago when he entered the embassy. That's what I believe that entails. I'm not sure that we've quite gotten to the point where we're litigating the issue of extradition. There are a lot of outstanding issues as to whether the UK is going to send him back to Sweden to face sexual assault allegations there. Is that case been fully abandoned? Is there going to be just a request that is entertained from the United States? Or what is going to happen next is not entirely clear, but we know that we've still got the grand jury investigation unfolding in the United States. What is probably the biggest development in the last week related to all of this is that the appeal that was filed by Chelsea Manning, the person who disclosed all of this material to WikiLeaks that was published in 2010, that is really the center of all of these cases. she had requested release from jail because she refused to testify before this grand jury, and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals denied her request, and so she will remain in jail. And there's some other ways that they can challenge her jailing, but for right now, this remains this means of coercing her into providing testimony against Julian Assange.
Yeah, I was just reading about that before we went on the air about her appeal being denied, and let's get to that in a minute, because as you said, I mean, that's at the center of all of this, and I mean, in a lot of ways, what they're going after Assange with is directly related to this. Obviously, there's something they want, or they think that they can get Manning to say something that would incriminate Assange, or would at least lend credence to at least one of the charges that they're bringing against him, which is this hacking charge. Can you explain a little bit what this is, Kevin? Because I found myself kind of confused about what are they actually going after him with? Why are they accusing him of hacking? Is this even hacking? So talk a little bit about this. I mean, I know you wrote some interesting articles that we'll link up to on shadowproof.com talking about this and the affidavit, which we'll get to. But what's this charge of hacking? Because that's what he's being charged right now in the UK with. And, other people have said this before. It seems like that might be just sort of like a means to an end, like an easy way to get him extradited. So talk a little bit about what he's being charged with at the moment.
Yeah, so first off, I'd hesitate to use the word hacking. That's maybe a sort of pedantic debate that we could get into, and I'm sure that somebody who worked for the U.S. government would be eager to have it with me. But the word hacking does not actually appear in the indictment against Julian Assange. And so I'll just use specifics because I do think that it matters, even though it would all be criminalized under the same law, which, by the way, is antiquated, terribly antiquated. We're talking about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and this is something that the Electronic Frontier Foundation has actually done a lot of work to challenge in the way that it doesn't quite fit the world that we live in today. It's at least a couple decades old as far as I recall. And so in the past, this law has actually been used to target people, just as an example of why I say it's outdated very quickly. In the past, you've had people who are supposedly affiliated with Anonymous who engaged in what I consider to be digital sit-ins on websites. And when they committed the denial of service attacks on a website and took it down, that was called hacking, even though it's not really doing anything to the infrastructure of the website. It just makes it inaccessible for a short period of time. And the CFAA had been used to criminalize them. So, I mean, I think what you have here is an interpretation of that law to be used against Julian. So let's get to the specifics of the case. So they're saying that Julian Assange committed conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. And there's also somewhat so there's only one count that was charged against him, but there's also something there about working to defraud the United States, which is a part of the general U.S. criminal code. And in this computer charge, basically what they're saying is that there was an agreement over cracking a password, and that at some point in these chats where they really claim that Julian was on the other end of these encrypted chats and was talking to Chelsea, that Chelsea said to Julian, do you have a way to help me go around this secret network? It was called CyberNet. It had all these databases of information. It was actually put together after the September 11th attacks so that agencies could do a better job of being connected to one another. And so she said, would you be able to make it possible for me to get in here without people seeing that I'm in the network? And he said, allegedly, he said, I think that's something that we would be able to work on. And then he went to work looking to see if he could come up with a way to crack it. And according to the indictment, that was never found. There's no evidence in the indictment that anything was ever cracked, which is why it's a conspiracy and not an actual crime against him for cracking a password. But the reason why I say it's not hacking is because she had access to these networks already and didn't need him to help her get access to the networks. And in fact, it's more like, to me, rather than thinking of it in the terms of like somebody was telling me how I could get into a vault and remove something that was stored away and then burglarize it and walk away without, with everything I wanted. Essentially what they're accusing Julian Assange of doing is giving her a kind of like trying to give her an invisibility cloak so that she could do the stealing and people wouldn't be able to tell who it was that had opened the vault.
Right.
So I think there's a clear distinction there. And I think that while it does potentially fall into something that can be criminalized, there is a clear motivation behind doing this because you're working with a source who has said, I have access to this information. And we know that Chelsea Manning's talking about different sets, and she's describing human rights abuses and issues of war, and she's talking about things she sees that diplomats are doing, and she's asking questions about in this particular conversation, she's asking about Guantanamo files and wondering if there's any value to releasing these detainee assessments. And Julian apparently says, if he is in fact the person she is chatting with, that these detainees, their files would be useful, especially to the lawyers who are trying to litigate their cases and the public, and especially because it might expose who these people really are and what we've been led to believe about them and whether that's true or not. And I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he says to her. And so if the password cracking is happening around that, then his source protection is basically knowing that there might be something that could be really essential to revealing about what the U.S. government is doing with Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. And so I'm not here to say what's right or wrong. I'm trying to put it into a context that as a person who's working for a media organization, he's looking out for a source and trying to help that source not be detected by the most powerful government in the world.
Right. And I think it's you're so spot on there, Kevin, with not characterizing this as hacking. Because, again, I said it sort of inadvertently, but, again, it's because all the mainstream media that you see, it's this hacking this, hacking that. And I think that's a very clever PR tactic to get everyone comfortable with that being the vernacular, even if it's not at all true. And again, too, hacking, there's all sorts of connotations and preconceived ideas about what that is. Quickly, though, and I don't know if you have an answer to this, but even the Assange offering the passwords, let's say that he, it wasn't even about trying to protect Chelsea Manning, but, he was just trying to help her get into, these particular files. I mean, is that even, like, illegal? I mean, I've seen people present the argument that if you were sent, like a box with a lock on it, and you worked at the New York Times and there was a note, there's important, documents in here related to some case you're investigating. If you tried to pick the lock and open it, which is sort of the similar, idea with the passwords, I mean, would you go to jail for doing that? I don't know if you know an answer to that, Kevin, or if there is one. But again, to me, that seems like they're really kind of playing fast and loose with, what is hacking, what isn't hacking, and the whole password cracking in general. I don't know. Do you have any idea about that?
So that sounds like a question for a lawyer, a really good lawyer who would know about the different liabilities that a media organization must consider when publishing information. But generally speaking, we recognize a fairly universal right to publish. Mm. And that's evidenced by the fact that something that we may get into a little bit more later on in the show is nobody questioned whether the New York Times had a right to publish the emails from Clinton campaign chairman John Podesta, even though it's mostly a consensus that that was hacked material or that was stolen material. It was taken from somebody's account and It shouldn't have. But it became public, and I argue there were elements in there that were of public interest, and they had value to us understanding. And there were things that an organization was deceptively hiding that had wide implications for people. But there's nobody suggesting that the New York Times be prosecuted for that, even though they were, by all accounts, publishing stolen material. So I think the focus here is that what you really have, and I think in general, this almost encapsulates everything about this indictment and a lot about what the U.S. government has done toward WikiLeaks. You have a standard for the New York Times and the Washington Post because the government mostly believes that their motivation is going to be one that is considerate of the agenda of the U.S., whether it be foreign policy or even domestic policy. They do not believe that they are trying to be a disruptive force. The New York Times and Washington Post wants to exist, and in many ways, the work that they do is about, and they would probably tell you this if you asked an editor, it's about trying to make the U.S. government function better. It's not necessarily adversarial. It's about, like, how can we fit into making things work more efficiently? And then if you look at WikiLeaks, it could not be more opposite. It has let's just, because it's less controversial, let's just take the way they were in 2010, because that's what we're dealing with here. In 2010, the whole organization, which had people who were associates, and then they were working with media partners, and then there was Julian Assange, and all of these people had no interest in working with the U.S. government, trying to be considerate of, okay, whether you're trying to take care of this related to the Afghanistan war or Iraq war, or okay, you're engaged in these efforts with diplomats and you want those to be protected. I mean, they believe that all of this stuff it was okay to question what was going on in any part of these operations, whether it be military or diplomatic. There was so much being kept secret that it was something that could be called into question. And I think the willingness to put it out there in the public was because they didn't identify with the priorities of the U.S. government. Their priority was, well, you're trying to hide this, and let's show the public what you're trying to hide.
No, I mean, all good points, and I do want to get into the New York Times and other outlets in a moment, or a little bit later, because I think there's a lot of larger implications, and again, very much to what you were talking about there, Kevin, about that the function of these large corporate media entities is not to be adversarial to the government, but to make their lives easier and to facilitate information from the government to the public in the best possible way. But jumping back a little bit to Assange and some of these other charges, I mean, the other, and I don't know that this is specifically he's being charged with this right now, or if this is in reference to the 2017 FBI affidavit, but we have to assume that this is going to be in the works if he is extradited back to the United States. That he will be charged with aiding the enemy. And there's some interesting kind of stuff in that affidavit. Again, you wrote a good article about this for Shadowproof. People should look over. They can also look over the full 40-page affidavit. But let's just talk about this aiding the enemy thing, because it's interesting, because as you pointed out in your article, they couldn't actually get Chelsea Manning on this. So it's interesting that they seem to be kind of bringing it back again with Assange, and of course their attempts to try to link, WikiLeaks and Assange with the Taliban and, of course, Osama bin Laden. So talk a little bit about this, Kevin, this allegation that he was aiding the enemy, essentially because the Taliban and bin Laden possessed a computer and could Google WikiLeaks.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure that we place this in a context so people can understand. So this affidavit is the theory of the case that's behind the indictment. And the and it connects to the indictment on the one count. And there is no Espionage Act offense charged, and there is no aiding the enemy charge, and there is no, sedition offense or anything like that against Assange. What they're charging is the conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. And then what I argue is that it's as it's charged, if you read the language in the indictment, what I argue is because it's so identical in many ways to the language in the Espionage Act, that what they've really done is they've charged him with an Espionage Act violation that looks like a computer crime that has that grafted on at the end because they know that has more likelihood of surviving a challenge because he's going to fight the extradition, and they need a charge, and they need to be able to bring a crime against him that isn't seen as entirely political. And for the most part, in Europe, it's taken that the Espionage Act is a law that is largely used to charge people with political offenses. And so they make it about computer intrusion because that's something that the European Union will recognize, or that the UK will recognize as an extraditable offense. And so in this theory of the case that was written by FBI Special Agent Megan Brown, we see the broad contours of what's being criminalized, and specifically it goes into detail about how these Afghanistan war logs were potentially endangering U.S. troops and Afghan civilians, and by their release, they aided enemies of the United States. And I think that that's important for people to hear, because if you thought this was all about hacking, there's a whole lot in this affidavit and in parts of the indictment that go towards WikiLeaks' publication of information and accuse WikiLeaks of soliciting leaks. And that is language that is really about criminalizing journalism, not going after a narrowly focused issue of did or did not Julian Assange help hack or crack into a password or something like that. And so it's really important to pay attention to this. And this affidavit, as I point out, raises some aspect of a case that is very familiar to me because it was brought against Chelsea Manning during her court-martial. And when she was accused of aiding the enemy, one of the pieces of evidence that was brought out was that Osama bin Laden had requested copies, I think, of these Afghanistan war reports. Yeah. And he had sent a letter to someone in Al-Qaeda and had asked for that person to gather this Pentagon material, send it back to him. And then there was a letter from that member of Al-Qaeda to bin Laden that had attached copies of some of these reports. And by the way, this is something that anybody could do because it's available on the internet. And in fact, if Osama bin Laden had any clue how to use Google, he could have gone on and found these. If he had any idea how to use a computer or whatever, if he'd ever been on a computer, he could have. What this just shows is that probably he did not understand computers one bit. But they're using this as a way to criminalize WikiLeaks now, in the same way that they were trying to use it to criminalize Chelsea Manning. And in a way that, like, if this had actually passed in the court-martial, it would have been something the government could use to criminalize the New York Times or the Washington Post and any other media organization that engaged in this kind of publishing. Because what you're saying is anything, and to criminalize me, what you're saying is anybody who puts anything out on the internet can be accessed by terrorists. And if they use it for their own purposes, then you could be liable for what they do. And that's just not how, that's just not a reasonable way to set up anything, but obviously it's useful for the government if they want to shut down people who are challenging them. And so Chelsea Manning was acquitted. There was not enough evidence to convict her of aiding the enemy, and she survived this. But now we have, as you see, a government that is putting this into the indictment or the theory of the case against Assange and is willing to inflate it to that because, again, I go back to this, they do not think that Julian Assange identifies with the United States and its agenda. They don't see him as a person who cares about what the U.S. wants to do, and so they want to target and punish him for challenging the United States.
And I think it's in the affidavit. I might be mistaken about this, but there's some reference to like a news article, might have even been like the New York Times or something, that the journalist in question had spoken with his Taliban sources, and there were these members of the Taliban saying, "Oh yeah, of course we've been searching it," and again they're trying to link that this is somehow, like you said, that they're creating this link that because WikiLeaks put out the Afghan War Logs and because members of the Taliban possess the internet, that means that he should go to jail. Also, there's the question of, is a foreign journalist even, like, is that even applicable? That they would have to adhere to U.S. secrecy laws regarding the publication of documents and things like that. That's always sort of struck me as bizarre, or simply just there is no legal argument for that. Really, why should Julian Assange have to follow U.S. secrecy law? He's not publishing in America. The New York Times is. Maybe they would be on the hook for that, but not necessarily Assange. But again, like you've been saying, Kevin, this is really all kind of going towards criminalizing journalism in general. And maybe we can kind of talk about that aspect a little bit more, explore that, kind of flesh it out. The sort of implications that this can have for journalists seems quite terrifying. Again, theoretically, this could criminalize any and all journalism. As you said, if you wrote a story for Shadowproof, I don't know, about whatever, Reality Winner, right? Or about some other leaker or whistleblower or something, and for, some criminal entity reads that and then commits something because of it. Is Kevin Gosztola going to go to prison? It's a very slippery slope where it almost seems like the publication of any information that any person out there could get access to and do something bad with, or do something bad, quote unquote, because of it, you could go to jail for that. But beyond that, this issue of like criminalizing what's not considered journalism or journalists, and that the real journalists are like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, etc. All of these, that seems even more kind of dangerous, where they really are defining what journalism is. I don't think they're going to criminalize journalism across the board, but to define it so narrowly, I'd like to get your take on that, Kevin, because that to me seems scary, where again, like what you were saying earlier, that the New York Times and other mainstream corporate news outlets, their goal is not to actually enlighten people about what's going on in the world. It is to facilitate, in many ways, public relations for the government, to kind of ease, to help information flow from the White House to the average person in a way that is not so as adversarial as they might like to pretend it is. So I'd like you to talk about that. This idea of redefining journalism.
Yeah, so this is such a dangerous case, in my opinion, because what they're doing is seeking to define how a journalist can gather the news. And it's not really so much that they're criminalizing publication, although they are, but it's really that they're looking at the ways in which Julian Assange operated and potentially other WikiLeaks associates operated, and they're saying that kind of conduct is criminal without there actually being clear laws that say to you and me that that behavior is criminal. And that's maybe a little bit confusing and undefined, but so to speak, what I'm saying is that Julian Assange is engaging in behavior that we've seen happen between journalists before there was the age of the internet and everyone was sharing information over the world of digital websites and everything. I mean, what we're talking about here is a government saying that you can't that they can go after Julian Assange because he spoke to Chelsea Manning and potentially he encouraged her to provide more information. I have news for people. This is what journalists do with their sources. It isn't that they're trying to get them to commit crimes, but if I have a source who comes to me and says, I happen to have this information that will show that there is corruption and fraud going on, and it's rampant. It runs rampant in the Pentagon, and would you like to have this information? And I say, yes, I would like to have this information. Or let's take it a step further. What if they just talk about this information to me and I say, well, I could do a story with you telling me about this, but if you give me documentation and I'm able to publish it, we'll have an even better story than if I just publish your words and you say that the Pentagon is committing massive fraud and corruption in X program or X country. So if you give me documentation, I promise you that your story is going to do a lot better. I've just solicited a leak, but I'm doing journalism. As I understand it, that's something that people have always done. We could take a legendary journalist, Seymour Hersh, who has a vast record of 40 years of work, who says himself that part of journalism is actually seducing your sources, is getting them to feel comfortable with you until they finally are willing to pass on those key details that relate to things that are going to provide you the major stories that you need to be effective and have an impact as a journalist. So you want to talk and you want to make relationships with people, and then when they feel comfortable with you, they'll pass on information.
Just to jump in very quickly, Kevin, on that exact same note, because like you said, that is what journalism is. I mean, what do people think detectives and the FBI and police do? I mean, that's part of their job as well. I mean, you could be infiltrating some criminal organization, and some guy could come to you and be like, hey, I want to take down so-and-so. Well, fine, but I need you to commit more illegal crimes, on their behalf so that we can build a larger case. And don't worry, because, we'll protect you later from other law enforcement agencies that might want to come after you. I mean, it's like that's done every day, and that's arguably way worse, where you have law enforcement agencies allowing people to commit crimes and go totally unpunished to maybe get someone down the line. But, as you say, I mean, a source coming to you and saying there's massive corruption and fraud happening at, the Pentagon or whatever it is. And suddenly that's illegal. And yeah, just to point out to people that, like that sort of thing happens. And many times it's not for the greater good. It's it's for people to sort of climb, the ladder of law enforcement. But continue again, Kevin. Jump back in there if you want to. With, this, like we said, it's criminalizing just everyday journalistic behavior. Again, it's like if this kind of comes to pass, what are they going to teach people when they go to journalism school? Don't seduce your source.
Yeah, I don't know. Other than I didn't go to J school, as they say, and so I don't really know what people are being taught. In fact, for those of you listening right now, if you're contemplating journalism, don't spend money on J school.
Absolutely.
Try to find a way to just start doing it. Like, I always tell people who want to get into journalism that you find a topic that you want to specialize in. You find something that really animates you, just like I did, which actually was Chelsea Manning's case, and you focus on it, and you become an authority for that specific story, and then you build your following and reputation around doing effective work on something that you're really focused upon. So there's my free journalism tip for the show. And I did this thing where on Twitter I went through the affidavit and did a whole thread that people can find just by doing a search for my handle at Kevin Gosztola and then FBI affidavit. And it goes through some of the examples of how the U.S. government is really targeting Assange for his role in publishing information. I just want to point this out because I think this is an effective way for people to really see that this isn't just about going after somebody for a computer crime. So if you look at the introduction in the affidavit, as I pointed out, the issue of concealing communications, masking identities, and employing encryption is seen as a way to enable the criminal conspiracy. This is a function of journalism now. We have lots of people from The Intercept to other outlets that are engaged in this in order to protect their sources. You have this allegation of a specific illegal agreement, which we've talked about over the password cracking. But the focus is actually much broader because they bring in the Afghanistan War Logs to the whole theory of the case. And it seems like what they believe Assange should have thought about is Chelsea Manning had already disclosed these Afghan and Iraq war logs to WikiLeaks, and that Manning was going to leak more information, and so he should have been more considerate of the secrecy system in the United States and backed away and recognized that he was not authorized to receive classified information, and so he needed to tell Manning, I suppose, don't give me any more information, or whatever leaks he had, he was supposed to turn over to the U.S. government because it wasn't his information. By the way, this is not a standard that's imposed on anyone at the New York Times or the Washington Post. Nobody in government would ever suggest that a Post journalist or a New York Times journalist had to turn away information that was being passed on to them by someone in the government. So then it's a suggestion that they're collaborating. There's a discussion about the public release of the information, and this somehow is taken to be a way of engaging or cementing the conspiracy. But this is just really, I think, what happens with a publisher and a source when you're talking about the material. You're developing trust. The person who's your source wants to know that you're going to handle what they give to you properly. So you talk about whether you think it's something that could have an impact or not. Is it in the public interest? Do you want this? What are you going to do with this information? Which, by the way, now's a great point, a great point in the show to make sure everyone understands that there was information that Chelsea Manning passed on to WikiLeaks that was not published. It involved the Iraqi Federal Police, and it actually was something that Chelsea Manning was working on directly because she herself was concerned that she was doing intelligence work that was leading to people who were political opponents of the Nuri al-Maliki government in Iraq, and that the government of Iraq was rounding up dissidents, that they were doing this with her own intelligence, and those people were facing detention and abuse, if not torture, because of stuff she was doing. And she had looked at something they were accused of writing, these literature about the government, and it turned out it was just basically like a manifesto that was sort of like anti-government. And she basically was really concerned because it's like, this is a freedom of speech issue. They weren't doing anything wrong. They're not like promoting terrorism or anything, but yet they're now being detained. And she tried to release material to WikiLeaks to publish, and WikiLeaks didn't publish it because, for one, she was concerned that they were going to publish the documents that she provided, and if those documents were published, it would have outed her and made it clear who had leaked this material. And so ultimately, Julian Assange could not publish the material and satisfy her because he wasn't going to just like vaguely represent what the documents were. They either publish all of the documents or they don't publish anything. So that didn't happen. But anyways, I'm just saying that because there are these conversations happening in this time period in the indictment that are all about like journalism. It's all about like what can we do for this source? And it's a source asking a journalist, what can you do for me? And that's standard. That's what's going on. And yet, as you read through this affidavit, there are sections where the FBI is criminalizing WikiLeaks for publishing Iraq and Afghan war logs, saying that, and I want to point out this phrase, that it would cause injury to the United States. Cause injury to the United States is not just a random string of words. It's actually what's in the Espionage Act. And that's not what was charged here, but it's very clear that that's sort of the direction they want to go with this prosecution. We talked about the aiding the enemy thing already. And I think that that's a huge thing, again, because it's being recycled against Julian Assange, and yet it's part of a failed case that was already brought by the U.S. military. It didn't work when they brought it. There's a section about the WikiLeaks publishing cables. It mentions the issue of IceSave, which was a thing in Iceland. There was a Reykjavik cable that got a lot of attention. There was this huge scandal around banking back in 2010. Yep. One of the things that was like really notable for what WikiLeaks did. And you have the sentence, WikiLeaks received and published classified documents despite their clear markings indicating that they are classified. This is criminalizing Assange for journalism. So I just mentioned all of those different things to give you a better sense of what is being criminalized through the FBI's theory of the case.
Right, because, I mean, yeah, what the hell is the implication of that? That if you're a journalist and you received classified documents from a government source, you're supposed to, oh, you know what, I don't have clearance to, to read these or publish them, so I'm not going to. I mean, I don't even understand. That's such a, I mean, just a, for lack of a better word, lame excuse.
But quickly, to your question about secrecy laws and whether somebody who isn't a citizen of the U.S. has to follow any of these secrecy laws, I think that that's an element that I have yet to fully explore. I plan to explore it as this case continues to unfold. But it's a really alarming future that we're setting up here if you impose this regime, so to speak, where anybody throughout the world has to follow U.S. secrecy laws. Because what it does is it invites all these other countries to impose their secrecy laws on foreign journalists. That means that China can impose secrecy laws on people outside of China. It means that Russia can impose secrecy laws on people outside of Russia. It means, as is already done, Israel can impose secrecy laws on people around how they cover their stories about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and everything. And so it means that other countries could justify doing this to journalists. And so it creates a kind of, I mean, this is kind of a cliched phrase, but for lack of a better cliche, Wild West sort of thing where, any journalist has to be mindful of what secrecy laws exist in order to make sure that they don't run afoul while they're working in country. And so, I mean, I think it would really discourage people from various countries. It would discourage me from going to any other country to do work. I would probably want to just stay in the United States and know exactly what those laws were and be sure that I abide by all of those laws. But I don't want to have to worry about whether I'm violating Russian laws and Chinese laws and Iranian laws and all these other places. I just want to focus on one set. One set of laws is enough for me to worry about. I don't need to worry about half a dozen.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Kevin. That was literally my next point. I had all these notes written about that, but you summed it up so well. I mean, that to me seems like such a terrifying, possible outcome of this is other countries, like, again, what if Iran or China or Russia or any country that is, adversarial to the United States, they start locking up American journalists for reporting on, their country's secrets. I mean, are we really going to be like, oh, that's okay. Sorry. I mean, it's a dangerous precedent to set. Especially, there's the journalism is such a globalized industry. There are people from America working in all corners of the globe for various news outlets. And again, we don't seem to have it would be one of those, I'm sure some members of Congress and the FBI and the Justice Department they'd have no problem if there was an American journalist, who was leaked secrets about North Korea's, nuclear plans or Iran oppressing people or Venezuela. Imagine that. They're not going to have any issue with that happening. But if Maduro starts locking them up for violating secrecy laws, oh God, they're going to just throw a fit over it. The other thing too is on the same token is, I think it will also, I'd love to get your quick take on it. I think it'll also limit, or it could create an environment where there are potential whistleblowers out there in other countries that are afraid to blow the whistle. Because, what if you're in some country that is closely or moderately aligned with the United States, and maybe you're leaking information that could that could hurt the United States. Are you going to leak that knowing that you might be extradited because you violated U.S. law? If you're a journalist, are you going to pick up that case knowing that you could be extradited for breaking U.S. secrecy laws? You could think of an example, like if you're in Afghanistan or Iraq or, any of the countries that we're militarily involved in, people might not be willing to speak out when there's abuse and corruption because they might be extradited to the United States for, violating the Espionage Act or something of that nature. So again, it's also just like a dangerous environment where, of course, it just creates more secrecy and, more lies and whatnot. So very kind of terrifying. We are coming up towards the end of the hour here with Kevin Gosztola of Shadowproof.com. There's a few other little things I just wanted to kind of get your take on, just because they, of course, kind of pop up more and more. I mean, what do you make of these crazy stories coming out of the embassy, about him smearing feces on the wall? And I'm sure you've seen these, Kevin, these like videos of him, quote unquote skateboarding and doing kung fu. I mean, it looks like he's doing Tai Chi. It's also like he has been in there forever. I mean, and believe me, I would think that Julian Assange would probably be a terrible house guest for 7-8 years. But, where's the video of him smearing poop on the walls? Are we just going to hear more and more of this?
Where is the video of Julian smearing poop on the walls? They have one of him on a skateboard, so they should be able to show us the one where he smeared the poop on the walls.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that doesn't sound like a serious thing to say, but that's the only reasonable thing to say in response to these officials of Ecuador who are truly, I believe, trying to cover up for betrayal that they committed. I mean that. I think that my message to the government of Ecuador is that you are now a pawn of President Donald Trump. You were once an independent nation. And I say this to the government of Ecuador, not to the people who live in Ecuador, who I think are quite aware of the political shift in their government. They used to have an independent government. They used to have a government run by a president who was called, as they like to call independent presidents, they called him anti-American. But that was because he was willing to set policy and he refused a U.S. military base. He was willing to stand up to the different international financing instruments out there that are usually used to control a country. So I'm talking about the IMF or the World Bank. he defaulted on Ecuador's debt because he was trying to get out of the sort of enslavement or exploitation that comes with following IMF or World Bank regulations, because you can't have you have to allow for capitalism to basically rule every aspect of your country if you accept the sort of developmental aid that comes from the IMF or World Bank for the most part. And so Rafael Correa, who made the decision to grant Julian Assange asylum, was an opponent of the U.S. I was willing to work with them if they were, wanted to talk about some issues. And there were programs that were maintained between Ecuador and the United States, but it was an independent government. And now Moreno, who is the president, is a more center-right, if not right-wing president, who is willing to cater to Donald Trump and John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, and supports the intervention in Venezuela, and it just supports this whole future that is much more dark, in my view, and that's why they were willing to toss Julian Assange to the United Kingdom and start this process where he could be extradited to the U.S. and go back on every sort of promise they had made to somebody who was granted political asylum. And by the way, because it has not been said yet, I now want to make sure I do not forget to say that they gave him citizenship.
Yeah.
They gave Julian Assange Ecuadorian citizenship, and this is what they are doing to him. And I think it is a clear violation of his rights. Regardless, I hate to say this because I don't think it really matters, but again, regardless of your views on an individual, regardless of what you think about the personality, and as far as whether he's a good house guest or not, none of that matters, because the fact is he had citizenship, and the country that was supposed to take care of him just chucked him to the United States to have their way with him. And now he's in trouble, and it's all their fault. And I don't know if anybody else who wants to declare or wants to pursue asylum with Ecuador will ever feel comfortable doing it, because it shows you that, whether it's 2, 3, or 7 years, there might be a way that the U.S. catches up and gets you, so that the Ecuadorian government doesn't actually protect you and give you the asylum you requested. Another quick point is just that as far as what was going on with Julian Assange in the embassy, we know from his own doctor, who will likely be a big defense witness if he ever comes to the United States, she described the way in which Ecuador was engaging in this kind of very intrusive surveillance on him, even violating his own doctor-patient relationship, collecting intelligence on what he was going through medically, and potentially, I believe it was probably what was going on, passing this information to the United States, the UK, any of these other places that have an interest in knowing what's going on with Julian Assange. And that material can be used against him. And, he had apparently potentially life-threatening issues with his dental care, with his teeth and stuff. And because he was isolated and kept there and Ecuador wasn't doing enough, it seems, to make medical care available to him or whatever, he might actually be better off in the sense that now he's in a UK prison, and anything that is going on with his body, he's going to get treated there, because that's just what happens when you get incarcerated.
Right. No, so many good points there, Kevin, specific as, especially about Ecuador and, just how much of a pawn they've just become of the United States. And it's so interesting, you mentioning Correa, defaulting on all these IMF loans, and of course now Moreno had just received a huge IMF loan. So again, the government of Ecuador, the elite within Ecuador, seems to basically, for some IMF money, which will really only benefit them and not the actual people, are willing to sell out their own citizen, Julian Assange. A quite disturbing turn of events. It's something I think we'll have to, check in again with you in the near future. I want to thank Kevin Gosztola for joining us on the podcast. Quickly, Kevin, please let everybody know where they can go to follow your work.
Yeah, if you go to shadowproof.com, you can find the latest on this case, and then also on Twitter at Gosztola.
Absolutely, and I highly recommend people follow Kevin on Twitter. Check him out, his writing at shadowproof.com. We've done lots of shows with Kevin in the past on Reality Winner, also Allie Watkins, which, we didn't really mention, but, interesting, you want to talk about like unethical journalists. I mean, Allie Watkins, and I think she was treated unfairly. She still has her job at the New York Times. So, it's a case to look into. But I think we're going to end it here for the first hour. In the second hour, we are probably going to take some listener calls. So definitely call in or, go over to the chat room. If you want to talk about Julian Assange, anything like that, I'd be more than welcome to. Kevin Gosztola, thank you so much for joining us here in the first hour. And we'll be back after these quick commercial breaks.
Straight out of the subway in New York City. Yeah, baby. The radio show that never sleeps. Porkins Policy Radio with Pierce Redmond.
WallStreetWindow.com. Gold, silver, the stock market. WallStreetWindow.com. The brilliant author of The War State brings you exclusive reports about the big changes upcoming in the markets. WallStreetWindow.com.
Perhaps you're invested deeply.
Perhaps you're not in deep enough. Maybe you're thinking about getting started. WallStreetWindow.com. Michael Swanson, the brilliant author of The War State, understood these trends professionally for many years, and now he gives you the benefit of his knowledge. WallStreetWindow.com. Go there now. Go there now. Go there now.
Really hot looking?
Free Monday night.
A reminder that this is the voice of America broadcasting worldwide.
Transistor Radio.
Warning, warning, warning.
Uncle the Podcast.
The Ocelli Effect.
Jeffrey
Porkins Policy Radio with Pierce Redmond.
On Ocelli.com. News, entertainment, and more. You will learn something, children's. Ocelli.com.
to the man, Pierce Redman.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to Porkins Policy Radio. I am your host, Pierce Redman. If you are joining us here in the second hour, we are hopefully going to be taking some listener phone calls. So if you'd like to call in and chat with me, ask me a question, if you want to talk about what we were discussing in the first hour with our good friend Kevin Gosztola, then definitely call in. The number is 319-527-5016. Once again, that number is 319-527-5016. Well, just for people that don't know, when you do call in, you'll hear a little automated message. You'll be put on hold, and then Chuck will bring you onto the call, and of course, I'll introduce you. But very interesting first hour there with Kevin Gosztola. I know I've probably mentioned it many times before, but I highly encourage people check out shadowproof.com. There's lots of great stuff. There's other contributors as well. We always have Kevin on the show, who was a co-founder or the editor of Shadowproof, but there's lots of other great contributors there. Kevin actually does a really good podcast as well on shadowproof.com. Talks a lot about prison issues and a lot of the similar topics that we discuss here. Of course, we've done many shows with Kevin on Reality Winner. And I briefly mentioned Allie Watkins, who is a New York Times journalist that was involved in another whistleblowing case. Of course, now I am blanking on the name of the guy, the whistleblower. I can see the picture of him. He's an older gentleman, and I believe he worked. He did like congressional intelligence research or something like that. But anyway, Allie Watkins and this individual, who again I'm blanking on, they actually had an affair together, and lots of ethical questions about what was going on. Although, like I said, I think Allie Watkins was treated unfairly, and again, all of these questions of her, she's just a gold digger or a slut. There's horrible things that were hurled at her. That, of course, would never have been hurled at a man who's sleeping with a source or anything like that. But there you have it. And Kevin and I, we've spoken about the Allie Watkins thing. I think it was actually in a bonus podcast. So if you want to listen to that, if you want to learn a little bit more about the Allie Watkins case, which is very fascinating, and even the on the whistleblowing side of it, you get away from the sensational aspects of it. Very interesting. You can always go to patreon.com/Pierce Redman, and you can sign up to become a subscriber, a patron of mine, for as little as $1 a month. And of course, that single solitary dollar gives you access to the exclusive bonus podcast. And while we're on the topic of the bonus podcast, I do have the episode for this month is more or less done. I've got to do a little editing and tweak some stuff, but of course now I'm looking at my calendar. I don't know when. I mean, I will release it before the end of the month, but it'll probably be on April 30th or the 29th if you know me. It is a conversation with Dave Emery, of course, of For the Record, SpitfireList.com. We covered a little bit of the same ground that we did the first time around with Dave. And I think we'll kind of switch it up. I mean, Dave is sometimes when he kind of gets going, it's hard to jump in, and I don't want to jump. He's I think he's earned the right to go on if he wants to rant about certain things. So we covered a little bit of the same territory before about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and some of the Hindu fascist stuff. But I mean, there's some other stuff in there as well. Some interesting things about the fascist movement in Ukraine. We touched on some kind of older political figures that Dave thought were some good analogies for the idea that AOC is possibly a CIA plant. Whether she's aware of that or not is up to debate, and I think she isn't, and Dave would agree with me as well. But we talked about that with I believe it was Eugene McCarthy was the example that Dave used. So some interesting historical stuff there, and I think we'll do some. We might. I'd love to get Dave on just to kind of talk, JFK stuff and some of the older topics that Dave has covered in the past that I think people will be interested in. But anyway, enough of me kind of rambling there, trying to fill in a little bit of time. I do actually have some stuff that I wanted to get into here in the second hour that I think would also be great if people want to call in and talk about this as well. But maybe before I start kind of rambling on about this, I will just throw out the call-in number if you want to leave a comment, ask a question, if you want to complain about me or something I've said. You can call in to 319-527-5016, and we'll put you on the air straight away. But something that sort of, I caught my eye was this recent speech, I guess it was a speech and then a Q&A at Auburn University down in Alabama that CIA Director Gina Haspel gave. And this was I think it was April 18th is when, or at least that's when the YouTube video was uploaded of this conversation. So it's probably that day or the day before. But Gina Haspel went to speak at Auburn University. They called it like an intelligence forum, which is a joke because there was nothing, she gave this speech that, I'll link up to the text if you want to check it out, but also the full video. She gave this speech about the CIA, and we'll get to that, and, commitment and all this other nonsense. And then she sat down with Lieutenant General Ronald L. Burgess, who's a very influential former director of the of the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, very instrumental in structuring much of the war on terror that we've come to know and love, and we'll get to that in a bit. But basically then, he gave her a bunch of softball questions, which she answered. So there was nothing, there's no real, forum or anything going on here. But it's interesting. And I'm being told we've got a question in the chat. Of course, I don't have the chat room open, so I will try and bring that up. But, interesting to me with the Gina Haspel thing for a number of reasons. One is that she really doesn't, for lack of a better word, put herself out there. Before I jump into the Gina Haspel discussion, Chuck has sent me the question. So this was regarding. So I'm reading from the chat room regarding the discussion of a journalist publishing information that a person then uses to commit a crime in the deposition of Alex Jones, who is a SH blank T. That's how they spelled it. He was getting grilled for publishing an address of a PR organization run by one of the Sandy Hook parents. A listener of his apparently committed some kind of assault on the man, was arrested, and the conditions of her sentencing included not consuming InfoWars content directly implicating Jones in causing the attack. Given that Alex Jones is a focal point for derision against the alternative media, it seems relevant that a journalist is under fire for publishing information that is used to commit a crime. And this is from Corey Fromid, which is his chat name. I might be pronouncing that wrong. I think that's I'm glad that you brought that up, Corey. Yes, this is a woman who was supposedly an avid follower of Alex Jones and of InfoWars, and I don't remember. I can't remember exactly the specifics of this assault, or I don't know if she actually assaulted him, or if she was like sort of stalking him. And I believe she used to show up at like town hall meetings and other various real public forums, related to Sandy Hook, what was going on, and she would attack people and threatened to expose them and, that they were murderers and whatnot. That did happen. I was sort of vaguely aware that she existed, but it wasn't until I listened through on the Jones deposition that I, discovered that, part of her sentencing was that she was barred from ever watching or consuming InfoWars media, which is crazy to me. I don't know how they enforce that, but there you have it. I don't know. Maybe they check her internet history, so that she can't watch InfoWars. Chuck is saying sex offenders are not allowed to have pornography upon conviction after all. So, absolutely. So I think it is good. I mean, clearly a person like that is swayed by I guess the first question here, or something we might want to address is, is Alex Jones really a journalist, or is he a performance artist? And while I think that I don't really think he's a journalist, I do think that I've made this point before. I mean, in a strictly free speech argument, I am a little weary of some of the direction that the lawyer, whose name is also escaping me, who's representing the Sandy Hook parents. I'm a little nervous about the direction that he's going in, simply because it does seem to be kind of a bit of a slippery slope when it comes to criminalizing an idiot for saying idiotic things when we supposedly live in a free society where free speech. I think there is something to be said. I think we shouldn't be jumping for joy. Mark Bankston is the lawyer in question. We shouldn't be super excited over criminalizing that. But I think that's you can make that. I think that's a legitimate argument that Corey is making there, or at least bringing up. I don't regarding this. Yes, that is true. But that to me is a little bit different than WikiLeaks producing or publishing the Afghan war logs and then the Taliban reading them and then committing some kind of act, and therefore, we should blame WikiLeaks and Julian Assange for that. Number one, I don't know that that's actually ever happened. And I don't believe that there's ever been, an instance of that the media has pointed to, or that the government had. If there was such an incident, I think we would probably know about it, because the government would have probably charged him with that specific one. It's somewhat similar, people can remember back to the Bo Bergdahl saga and all those, he endangered all these people. And, yes, in a way he did. The fact that Bergdahl, wanted to become like Jason Bourne, his own words, and, walked away, and that people had to search for him. Yes, they were in danger. He was endangering lives in the sense that they're in Afghanistan. It's not a safe, secure location or country. The soldiers could have been attacked and killed, but that never happened. No lives were lost as a result of this. Nobody died. Nobody was injured. They didn't find Bergdahl, for years. It's interesting, point to be made. I think that's an apt one I think though, again, like with Alex Jones, it's like he is, in my opinion, totally, my opinion, I don't have, proof of this or anything, but in my opinion, Jones seems to want that sort of a reaction at times, or that he is aware, or maybe not that he wants it, but he is fully aware that there are people out there that are diehard InfoWars listeners, supporters. And he gets, they call, you listen to some of the call-ins, to InfoWars. I mean, they are out there. I think they're out. Even Jones is like, these guys are out there. Like, I don't want to really like. Alex Jones isn't trying to hang out with them at a bar. Have a beer, meet them. On a deserted street corner in Austin. I don't think Alex Jones wants to. So he knows who these people are. He knows exactly what buttons he can use to push them to do whatever. And again, too, I mean, Jones, I don't know the specific timeline, but, I believe by the time that woman was arrested for assault or, stalking, whatever the charges were on the Sandy Hook parents, there were other people, including that wrestler that used to, at one point was employed by InfoWars, and then, according to the deposition, Jones told him to stop, and he sort of fired him. That guy had been harassing parents. There were other people going around, associated with InfoWars, or at least purporting to be associated with InfoWars, that were harassing people. So he knew full well that was, going on, that was out there. That in the ether of his fandom, there were people that could or would be willing to do that. So I think it's a little bit different, from what they're charging Assange with, because again, I mean, and a lot of that too is like old material. Not all of it, but much of that was. It's sort of like, again, the case we made about the Pentagon Papers. I mean, nothing in there was necessarily like new info per se. This was an assessment of a decades long involvement in Southeast Asia. But I don't know. I'm seeing Corey saying I don't know exactly where I fall on the issue. It just seemed relevant. I completely agree. I think it is relevant. And listen, I think it's a dicey issue. I don't know. Like I said, I think Alex Jones is a real despicable sack of crap. I think that, I would love to see InfoWars go down, just because they do profit on the exploitation of other people's trauma, be it 9/11, be it Sandy Hook, be it anything. I mean, there's any number. Boston bombing, which is back in the news again. Maybe we'll talk about that. If someone wants to call in and discuss Bernie's comments on it. But I think at the same time, I don't know. I do feel conflicted about it. It's sort of like, who cares what he says? Who even cares if he says hurtful things and hurts people? It's like, are we really willing to trade that? I don't know. And I'm hearing Corey is from Delaware? Because as Ed has pointed out, as Chuck has pointed out, I always do that. We've got a lot of listeners from Delaware at the moment. So shout out to Delaware, I guess. Thank you for the comment. And like I said, I think it's something that we do need to discuss, because it's very easy to, like I said before, Alex Jones is the easiest target. He sucks so much, so immensely, is his suckiness. And there's so little there's really nothing redeemable about him. Any sort of honest, and I hate to say journalism, but any honest commentary that he may have done in the early 90s is so sullied by the fact that he has just become, at this point, a shill for the President of the United States. So much for the fight against the New World Order when it comes to Alex Jones. He's fallen so far from his own ideals, or whatever, the ideals originally of InfoWars. So it's easy to attack him. It's easy to pile on. But at the same time, I think it's dangerous. I think it is a slippery slope. As I said, I mentioned back on that episode where I talked about the deposition. I think that was with Ed Opperman. That Mark Bankston, the lawyer, he appeared to equate 9/11 and even more disgusting, the OKC bombing with Sandy Hook. And I say more disgusting with the OKC bombing because there really is no there is no doubt that there was a cover-up to the Oklahoma City bombing. I mean, that's more or less admitted, in the public discourse by the federal government. And certainly there's a lot more evidence that there was a cover-up. And I don't want to completely get bogged down in the OKC thing, but again, we something that Gina Haspel spoke about at Auburn just a few days ago was this, lone wolf terrorism. I mean, there was no lone wolf. I know the Oklahoma City bombing continually gets that's the lone wolf terrorism. There was McVeigh and Nichols. Terry Nichols went to prison for life because of that. It's also Michael Fortier and his wife, Lori, I believe is her name. I mean, the both of them, they pled out. But Michael Fortier went to prison and then was put in witness protection. So there's no lone wolf. I mean, that in and of itself is part of the cover up and the lie. It's sort of obscuring these other people, not to mention all the other stuff and Jesse Trenadu and the actual, the bombing itself doesn't make sense. One Ryder truck could never have blown up that much of a bill. I mean, there's so much. So to say that, the Sandy Hook truthers are the same as the people that have questioned the Oklahoma City bombing is dangerous. Absolutely. And that unfortunately is kind of, I think they're throwing out the baby and the bathwater when it comes to that. Just taking a quick sip of water. You may have noticed my throat's a little sore today. So if you want to give me a break from talking, you can always call in and chat and ask me a question. The call-in number is 319-527-5016. And just call in. You'll be put on hold briefly, and then Chuck will bring you live onto the call. But Corey, thank you for the comment. Shout out to Delaware once again. But I guess moving back, I'll because that took a little more time than I thought. I would like to just get a few things with the Gina Haspel, this speech and forum that she gave at Auburn. Because again, it's interesting. Gina Haspel, she's been CIA director for a year, which I kind of forgot about because she's so quiet and under the radar. She is like a very, she reminds me of the kind of old school intelligence, not even just CIA, but like, MI6, like who, for a while they used to deny that MI6 even existed, even though it has this huge, massive building, in the middle of London. And, the directors of MI6 were always very good. Up until fairly recently, they were not publicly known. And there are still lots of officials, high-up officials within the CIA that you will not easily find a way to, what their names are. Like director of ops, director of analysis, director of science and technology. These are not names that are out there. You if you try to look them up, you're not easily going to find them, or you may not ever really find them. And Gina Haspel, I think, kind of fits that bill. She's stayed very much under the radar. I think, Mike Pompeo also stayed under the radar. And I believe there was an acting director of intelligence in between that. But, you look at someone like Leon Panetta, who, I don't believe he understood the concept of being under the radar. And it was probably the most publicly available CIA director. I mean, he was on Top Chef, for God's sake. I think Leon Panetta's favorite place to be was in a chair in front of a camera. So it's, you kind of go from that culture to Gina Haspel, where it's like, we don't know. I mean, I believe her speech at Auburn is her first public appearance since her confirmation hearing a year ago. So that should kind of give you an idea about who this person is. And I think why it's important that when someone like Gina Haspel, I mean, whenever the CIA director gives speaks, our ears should kind of prick up. We should be concerned about that. But when it's a CIA director like Gina Haspel, who really does not have a public persona, we should really be paying attention, because there's always going to be some nuggets of information. There's always going to be a little bit of gold, spread amongst all of the crap out there. So just a couple of interesting takeaways. People might have seen that she spoke at Auburn because very early on she had these prepared remarks, of course, about how wonderful Auburn is and Auburn's rich history in the clandestine services. She mentioned this guy Johnny Michael Spann. People might have heard of him before. He was in fact an Auburn graduate. But he was also the first American, supposedly, the first American to die in Afghanistan. I think this was even before or just after the invasion. He was at a prison where they were holding all these Taliban prisoners and members, and there was a riot, and Johnny Michael Spann was killed. So he's always, of course, been lionized by the CIA and by the intelligence world in general. He went to Auburn, I guess. I mean, supposedly. That's what Gina Haspel said. And he was from Alabama. So, again, of course, it's great. It's wonderful. This, it's a story. And it was basically like a recruitment, for the students. And in fact, before they ended, they said, if anyone's interested, tomorrow in one of their, other theater spaces at Auburn, conference halls, they'll have all sorts of members from the CIA there if anyone's interested. So, that was interesting too. I mean, how open they are about recruiting on college campuses now, which they've always done. And it's interesting that Gina Haspel said that when she joined the CIA, and I think this was back in the late 70s, early 80s. I can't remember exactly when Gina Haspel joined, but it's interesting. She said, back in my day, they didn't recruit at college campuses, which is such a lie. Which shouldn't be surprising, but it's just a weird comment to make, especially given the fact that so much of the, OSS were completely filled with, Princeton, Yale, Harvard, trust fund babies. That's what created OSS, and that's, they use that same pool later on when they created the CIA in 1947. So that's a joke and a lie. Now maybe it's not quite the same as, the sort of open recruitment where, you can meet with, at a job fair for the CIA, but the CIA has always recruited from colleges. They're just, I think in the age that we're in, they're a little bit more comfortable with openly doing it. So Gina Haspel joined the CIA in January 1985. They were absolutely recruiting on college campuses in 1985, but was this sort of this pitch to join the CIA? It's so wonderful. A lot of the same kind of general platitudes and whatnot about how wonderful the CIA is, and it's about defending America and all that kind of nonsense. She did the it's filled with loving mothers and fathers that are making the world a safer place for their children, which is they love this image of loving mothers and fathers who are abandoning their families to live undercover, to deceive people and kill people in foreign countries, for large corporations and banks and arms companies and whatnot. Making the world safer for their children. She talked about the more diversity hires at the CIA, which is a big thing. If you follow like the CIA newsroom, which is just it's just the CIA's news and information, their blog, for instance, they're always going on and on about, diversity hires and whatnot. And Gina Haspel is a big, she seems, at least in public, is a big proponent of that. And it's funny too, we need to hire more diverse people so that we can, use them overseas because they understand the language and it's blah, blah. So it's basically just, we need more black and brown and Asian people so that we can oppress more black and brown and Asian people. It's as simple as that. And that's the only reason they want to push this diversity stuff. And again, the classic BS talking points about heroism, making the world safer, that it's about sacrifice, and slight allusions by Gina Haspel to the gray zone or black zone if you want to go so far, but that gray zone that the CIA operates in, where it's even when they're talking about the brave heroism and whatnot, they will openly admit to an extent that what they do is not necessarily legal, it's not necessarily good, and very very important point to make regarding this speech is nowhere in the discussion does Haspel ever say that this is about fighting for democracy. Now, I don't believe the CIA was ever about fighting for democracy, and I don't believe that they've ever used that particular slogan. But given the fact that we live in an age where so much of our foreign policy is dictated on the myth of fighting for democracy, human rights and whatever, it is refreshing to see a war criminal like Gina Haspel being fairly upfront. It's not about fighting for democracy. It's about ensuring America's national security. Now, even that, of course, is a lie, but there is some truth to it. America's national security is defined as, America being the dominant superpower, both economically, politically, in terms of everything. So in that sense, yes, that is what the CIA is doing. That is in the U.S. national security, if you define U.S. national security as being the dominant oppressor of the oppressed. So, but again, it's just an interesting point. Gina Haspel, like I said, makes some kind of allusions to that. There's something where she says, it's early on in the speech, she basically sort of alludes to, there's a lot of stuff the CIA is doing that you don't know about, and frankly, you don't want to know about, or something to that effect. Which to me is that's you wouldn't want to know what we're doing to protect you, to make the world safer for America and for American national security. But just like I said, we should always take notice of when someone like Gina Haspel, when the CIA director talks, because we will be given a slight glimpse into the reality of the world that we live in, where the people that are really in control, that are really in power, that are really making change for better or worse in the world, they are fairly honest. If you can kind of cut through a lot of the BS around them. And you will hear that Gina Haspel is very honest. This is nothing to do with democracy or human rights or really even making the world safer. This is about ensuring America's national security interests as defined by the CIA. And, the major banks and arms companies and Wall Street and all of the various pharmaceutical companies, all of the oil, all of these various entities. That is really what they're doing. So, interesting. There was also, like I said, people might have seen this or seen clips of it. There was someone that early on, started, yelling about, you're a torturer, you're a criminal, you should be rotting in prison. What about the people in Guantanamo? What are their names? You know what their names are. And, Gina Haspel just didn't really say anything, just sort of stared off, waited for him to finish, and then she continued. And I'll return to that in a little bit, because this particular person actually comes, I guess he wasn't ejected from the auditorium, and he was still there. But again, it's so funny to hear this guy have this outburst, not outburst, he's just stating a fact. She's a torturer. There was a piece by Carol Rosenberg, I think, at McClatchy. She used to write for the Miami Herald, and she's still stationed in Guantanamo. That's her beat. And she writes a lot on Guantanamo Bay. Carol Rosenberg wrote an article a little while ago I'll link to, that there also seemed to be, along with the Cat's Eye, which was a black site that Gina Haspel, a very famous black site that Gina Haspel ran in Thailand, and other ones too, Cat's Eye being a big one, that Haspel, it's rumored, was running even a super duper secretive black site in Guantanamo Bay that we've only now come to learn about. I'm not sure specifically if it was Haspel or others, but there was rumors and stuff that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had been tortured specifically at this black site in Guantanamo. Not just that they're torturing the people in Guantanamo just in general, but the force feeding. We don't really know what's going on in Guantanamo. Just the keeping them in solitary confinement at times, force feeding. The fact that they've never been charged with crimes and will never be charged with crimes and will die in Guantanamo Bay. That's a form of torture. But beyond that, that they had another place where they were specifically going to God knows what torture. And again too, if in a war zone like Afghanistan, Iraq or something, there's really who's gonna defend human rights. So especially if you're torturing Al-Qaeda operatives and Taliban members and Sunni extremists and ex-Baathists. But there is at least that semblance of they're even like in Iraq or Afghanistan, there's this colonial occupying government. There's somebody that you can petition. It's not going to go anywhere, but at least you can formally say, Amnesty International submits this to, the whatever head of military command who's in charge of operations in Baghdad, or, to the government. In Guantanamo Bay, there ain't nobody that's going to listen. There's nothing there. It is, a piece of our colonial history that we use specifically to brutalize and oppress people. So, I don't even want to imagine what happens at the black sites in Guantanamo Bay. As bad as Cat's Eye or the Salt Pit in Afghanistan as those are. At least we knew about those ones, right? We're only now finding out about the one in Guantanamo Bay. But anyway, this person kind of calls out Gina Haspel and then, quiets down. And it's so funny, too. She's talking about this, sacrifice and, that the CIA is this moral entity that wants to, help the world and blah, blah, blah. 3 days before this, Mike Pompeo was at Texas A&M. So I guess all of the war criminals and lunatics are speaking at colleges right now. So, again, keep your eyes out for that. Watch the Mike Pompeo one is even more sort of stomach churning because he's just such a slimy, fat little turd. But he was at Texas A&M and he went through his, when I was in West Point, good old G.I. Joe cadet at West Point, we were, the motto at West Point is we will never lie, we will never cheat, we will never steal. And then Mike Pompeo laughing is like, well, at CIA we lied, we cheated, and we stole. And and everyone else laughs. So again, they're very honest, surprisingly, when push comes to shove. And you see, there's no, especially with an entity like the CIA, their whole ethos is to deceive people, to elicit secrets, to keep secrets, to use secrets against people, and to kill people, and to overthrow countries. And in fact, you could argue that, the CIA is doing less keeping of secrets and discovering secrets, and is much more just an external force of American imperialism. It's not about gaining intelligence to safeguard America's interests. It really is about using it as an external proxy force with which to bring about the interests of America into fruition. But anyway, just an interesting thing. Again, Gina Haspel talking about the moral, upstanding CIA, and Mike Pompeo a few days before that saying, we lied, we cheated, we stole. And he said, something like, there were even whole divisions devoted to lying and cheating and stealing. So, there you have it. But the real kind of interesting point with this, or the sort of interesting part of this, was not really so much Gina Haspel, because she is actually quite a boring person. She's not very interesting. She has a very boring kind of, she reminds me kind of like your weird, quiet aunt, or like a strange family friend. She appears very kind of like quiet and boring, and I'm Gina Haspel, and like when she tries to tell jokes, it's like, I mean, it's embarrassing, but she sort of like will tell it, like at the Auburn thing, she'll like tell a joke, and then she'd kind of be like, more or less have to tell that, like, that's the joke now, and then everyone laughs. She's very unassuming, which I guess is probably why, she worked as a clandestine intelligence officer for decades. She probably would be pretty good, because she could blend in. She could look like your mother or your boring aunt or whomever, really. What's the disturbing aspect of Gina Haspel is that behind this unassuming, boring, ant-like figure is a person who, for all intents and purposes, enjoyed torturing individuals, enjoys being in charge of one of the greatest oppressive forces in the world that the world has ever seen. So that's what's kind of disturbing about Gina Haspel. But so when she's talking, you're kind of struggling to sort of stay awake and stay focused on it. But as I said, the moderator for this is Lieutenant General Ronald L. Burgess, and I don't know, but I believe Burgess might even he might have some have some other connection to Auburn University. I'm not sure exactly. And I believe he might be from Alabama as well. That might be his connection, or he grew up in Alabama. Or no, I'm sorry, he was born in North Carolina. So I don't know. Anyway, he was there. He was the moderator for this, and he, for people that don't know, Lieutenant General Ronald L. Burgess was, as I said, the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Very powerful. He's he keeps referring to himself as an intelligence professional. That's the new politically correct term. You're not a intelligence officer. You're not a, God forbid, they never say clandestine officers anymore. They don't like that term. I think it's too many negative connotations. Or intelligence professionals. And I guess Burgess would be more of an intelligence professional in the sense that he's not like Gina Haspel, who's actually out in the field. He sat behind a desk and decided how he wanted to kill people. If anybody, just want to remind people too, if anybody wants to call in, and if you watch the Gina Haspel speech, you want to call in and talk about it with me, the number once again is 319-527-5016. So definitely call in, leave a comment. But I'll continue on about the Ronald L. Burgess. He even himself admits in this Auburn conference or whatever that he's the father of Guantanamo, and he helped push it through. He was in charge of DIA when Guantanamo was coming into existence, and he helped push it along, helped it flourish. And he then goes into this interesting little diatribe, right? And I say again, interesting, because there's a lot of truth to what he's saying. There's a lot of lies as well mixed in. He is a classic spook, intelligence professional, excuse me. And it's really revealing in a stomach churning sort of a way. So he talks about that we're a nation of laws and civil liberties. Always got to preface it like that. And America stands above all else when it comes to law and civil liberties. This is the former director of the DIA talking to the current director of the CIA. And then and I'll read you this quote. And he's referring to, the people at Guantanamo Bay and himself as well. Because he says, because of that outburst mentioned Guantanamo, I'll address it. And he says, I don't think Gina has to respond to that, and she won't. But then he says, quote, "We did the best we could with the guidance that we were given, with the resources that we were given to protect the United States of America." And that's, and that's what he says after we're a nation of laws and civil liberties. And then he goes on to say that, I think the people that are still working in Guantanamo Bay are doing the best that they could, do with the guidance that they were given and the resources, and that they are constantly, thinking about law and civil liberties. So there's so many issues going on there. And again, this is very classic kind of espionage intelligence, security state doublespeak, where they're saying that, we're a nation of laws and civil liberties. We care about people's civil liberties being violated. Yet he's admitting that, well, we are violating them, but we're doing the best that we can. And at the same time, he's placing the blame sort of on them, but at the same time, he's also placing the blame on, we did the best we could with the guidance that we were given. So it's not even our fault. It's those other people. And the best that we could do with the resources that we were given. So maybe we weren't given the best resources, we weren't given the best guidance, but based on that, we did what we had to do to protect America. So again, it's none of this, and this protect America is really to protect the national security, to protect the secrets of America, especially when we're talking about people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, on what he knows and could say regarding some of the secrets of America. And then he, of course, follows this up with, and while, something to the effect of like, while I defend and I will defend his right to make the statement that he made, because we are a free country, there's a time and a place for that discussion, and that was not the time and the place. And again, referring to this guy. So, and this is so insidious about people like Burgess, and by extension, Haspel. He's admitting that they, at the very least, they pushed the boundaries of American law and civil liberties when it came to torture at Guantanamo Bay. And it's almost, part of me wants to be like, just say it, just call it like it is. You were torturing people, and you were doing it because that was the guidance that you were given with the resources that you were given to protect America. So you tortured people. Just admit it so we can move on. But there we go, Burgess. And this is his defense of Haspel. So you can assume this is exactly what she believed or would have said as well. Is that, he's equating what they were doing at Guantanamo as, necessary to defend that guy's free speech. They were, that's the circular, weird logic that only a twisted monster like Burgess could come up with. That they were waterboarding innocent people at Guantanamo Bay who had done nothing, were never accused of a crime, never, no evidence of a crime, but for whatever reason they were, kidnapped, rendered to probably multiple countries where they were tortured, then rendered illegally to Guantanamo Bay, an illegal U.S. possession in Cuba, waterboarded again, and will probably be kept there until they die, having never been charged with a crime or be put in front of a judge. So that guy that Yahoo in the audience could yell at Gina Haspel. I mean, it's the levels to which your mind has to work with something like that is so disturbing. And then, of course, the guy, he speaks up again, and he starts, he's yelling his questions and whatnot. And Burgess says, if you want to ask a question, you can wait your time. And he's saying all this like kind of weird stuff. It's like, you can wait your time instead of your turn with everyone else, and then you can ask your question. So and just keep this in mind. So he's saying like, okay, hold on, if you want to ask your question, just wait like everybody else and you can ask it. So when I heard that, I thought, oh, cool. Maybe there will be a Q&A. And whatever. And it seems like this guy he keeps kind of protesting, and then Burgess is like, or you can leave the auditorium. And then the event ends and they walk off stage. So another lie. Again, I don't know why we would ever trust, the former director of the DIA, but the whole thing was a lie. They were never going to ask that question. So again, and I don't know if that was like, maybe they were supposed to be a Q&A, but he doesn't want, any, unnecessary questions. And this guy is right that, all I'm doing is, she won't answer the question. So I'm just asking, when will she answer it? When will she tell us the names? And you just have to wait. So very disgusting. I mean, I know I might be kind of repeating myself with all of this, but it was so revolting to me. And then, of course, he just asked her a bunch of stupid softball questions about, what keeps you up at night, and what are the new developments that you've made, and what should women do to get ahead at the CIA, and tell us about all the women that you've hired. And of course, Gina Haspel mentions a bunch, general counsel is a woman, and the director of ops, director of intelligence, director of science and technology, the director of diversity and inclusion. They're all women. There's no names. You can't find those women anywhere. So are they women? We don't actually know. I know the general counsel is in fact a woman, Courtney Simmons Elwood, but she's general counsel. We know her name. We don't know who the director of ops is. So who knows if it's really a woman? Also, I guarantee you they're all rich white women. But whatever. The public affairs officer, Brittany Bramall, she's a woman, but she's public affairs. Of course, we're going to know who she is. So just, again, the secrecy alone in all of this, I mean, we really have to wonder, is anything that they're telling us truthful? Because again, I mean, Burgess says, if you want to ask your question about Guantanamo, you just wait until the end and then you can ask your question. To who? Because they all walked off. So anyway, I think that's all I've got to say on Gina Haspel and Ronald L. Burgess when it comes to this. I encourage people to check it out, although I've kind of ruined all of the interesting moments. But I think it's worth watching and listening to. There's other little stuff in there. There's some stuff that you might get that I didn't get when it comes to this, but these people, we should really pay attention when they speak, especially people like Gina Haspel, who are so under the radar. We don't know what she's up to. There is a moment where she talks about this sort of refocusing to Iran and Russia, because, we don't need to focus so much on, global terrorism, or that the focus, post 9/11 on the war on terror took precedent, but now it's more important to go back to Iran and Russia. So that's interesting. But we don't really know what they're up to. So when we only have these few public moments where they're speaking, we should be paying attention. The same goes for Mike Pompeo as well, who is, of course, more, as the head of the State Department, he is sort of more out there. But Gina Haspel, more needs to be done looking into her. I mean, of course, her whole legacy of torture. She is a complete product of the, post 9/11 war on terror world. who knows what she was doing, pre 9/11, and I believe is close with Alfreda Bukowski. Maybe that's who the director of ops is. Might be worth looking into. But I think I am going to leave it here for this week's episode. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I know that it may not have been the as exciting, having me ramble here in the second hour, but I do kind of like doing it from time to time. It's nice to to have this hour to kind of chat with people, kind of go off script a little bit. I'm going to have a great guest next week. I'm going to have Jenna Orkin on the show. She's done a ton of work writing about the toxic effects of the World Trade Center dust. So hopefully I'm going to have Jenna on for both hours. That'll be next Tuesday the 30th. I'll also have the bonus podcast out. Once again, if you want to support me, you can always go to patreon.com/Pierce Redmond. You can become a subscriber for as little as $1 a month. And of course, I implore you, I beg you, support the Ocelli Effect, support Chuck Ocelli. Go to Ocelli.com and you can give a donation. You can sign up on Patreon. I wouldn't be here without Chuck. He's the reason I'm doing the show. So support the both of us if you can. But until then, I will be talking to you all very soon.
That this is the voice of America broadcasting worldwide.
Transistor Radio.
Warning, warning, warning.
Uncle the podcast.
The Ocelli Effect.
Jeffrey.
Porkins Policy Radio with Pierce Redmond.
On Ocelli.com.